Hi, I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. I can't believe I'm going to admit this, but when I was in college studying design in the late 2000s, I was what we would now call an Apple fanboy. I watched all the keynotes and followed the company announcements and even had a picture of Steve Jobs hanging above my desk. Apple, it seemed to me, was one of the few companies that seemed to really understand design. It's hard to remember now when it seems every brand wants to be seen as design driven, but 15 years ago it was rare for a company to talk about design and sort of honor design as much as Apple did. I wasn't alone in this fandom. I think I had classmates who were interested in Apple like I was. Designers around the world were interested in Apple. In my classes, I remember Apple being used as examples for design in everything from advertising to the interfaces to the products themselves. Design trends, the sort of look of advertising and digital culture, it seemed flowed from Apple, spreading across the cultural landscape. While my fandom has waned as I got older, my interest in how the company operates has not. And my interest in how Apple thinks about design, especially as they've become the biggest company in the world, is still very strong. Is design to them the packaging? Is it aesthetics? Or is it embedded in every decision? Following the death of Steve Jobs and the exit of its longtime design chief, Johnny Ive, is Apple still as committed to design? A new book called After Steve, How Apple Became a Trillion-Dollar Company and Lost Its Soul by Tripp Mickle, in a way answers these questions. The book is ostensibly about Apple in a post-Steve Jobs world, but it's also a book about design and its role in the company. It's not the typical fare for this show, but as I read it, all these questions emerged about how to write about design in a sort of general context, the evolution of Apple's design teams and the increasing influence, and what happens when aesthetics get in the way of functionality. With these questions in mind, I invited Tripp on the show to talk about Apple and design and writing and reporting. Tripp is a tech reporter for the New York Times who has covered Apple extensively, and I was interested in how he learned to write about design and how design became the central narrative of this book. We talk about how Apple views design and the role of design teams in product development at the company. But this isn't just about Apple. There are lessons here, I think, about the myth making that emerges around design, about the downsides of design getting a seat at the table, and the complexities that go into producing products at this scale. It's a really fascinating conversation about the company that has, for better and for worse, shaped how a culture understands design. If you'd rather read this interview, a transcript for this episode, as with all of our episodes, is available on Patreon. Scratching the Surface is made possible because of listeners like you who help support the show each month. Supporters get bonus interviews, an exclusive monthly newsletter, and all sorts of other additional content. Students can support the show for just $3 a month, and we offer 2 additional tiers at $5 and $10 a month for all sorts of other content, as well as early episodes. You can head over to patreon.com/Surface Podcast to sign up and get immediate access to all of this content. Thanks for listening, and here is my conversation with Tripp Mickle. Your book is called After Steve, How Apple Became a Trillion-Dollar Company and Lost Its Soul. And I think this is not sort of the usual type of book that I would talk about on the show, but I was very fascinated by this book. And I think there's a lot of themes that do relate to my interests, because my reading of the book is that in many ways, this is a book about Apple in the post-Steve Jobs world and sort of the battle between design and business, or design and operations, or something. Design is very a big character in your book. So I'm curious to start kind of how you define the book and kind of how you define design's role in this book.
Yes, I mean, I think your read's accurate. I don't know that I would use battle between so much as the inherent tension between those two, and it does play out primarily in the decade after Steve Jobs, but it's rooted in as all things at Apple are in the Jobs legacy and what Jobs philosophy and aspirations for the company Apple were before his death. And I think it really explores what happens at Apple when Jobs is out of the picture. He was so skilled at balancing design with operations, which was part of the magic that created a what I like to call a Camelot and Cupertino, and led to the number of revolutionary products that they released in that decade after his return in '97. Increasingly over time, as a consequence of his absence and as a consequence of the company's astounding growth, the balance between design and art, if you will, if you want to be
Mm.
more poetic about it, and commerce get out of whack. As Tim Cook, who's comes from an operational background, is very much an engineer, in mind, and has less of those aesthetic sensibilities, becomes more empowered and puts his stamp on the company. Design's place and prominence in Apple begins to attenuate, and that's really the arc of the story that's told here, and it's told in a reductive fashion by focusing on the two figures at Apple who embody those two poles of the company, commerce and art, and that's Tim Cook on the commerce side and Johnny Ive on the art side.
I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about sort of how you arrived at that tension as being the sort of thread of the book? Because I think it's a unique conceit, but a very compelling way to tell this story. Was that something you kind of arrived at earlier, or was that a story that emerged through the reporting?
It's both things, which is a weird way of answering your question, but it's both something that I arrived at early, but then in terms of how it played out in the structure, that was something I arrived at later through the process of
Mm,
writing. I arrived at it early because in 2019, when Johnny Ive left the company, there was a scramble among all Apple reporters at the time, and I was covering Apple for the Wall Street Journal to explain why this seminal figure at the company was departing. I mean, it
mm,
just caught many people off guard. Those of us who've been covering Apple for some time, it was not all that surprising because it was known, but hadn't been reported that Johnny Ive had gradually stepped back from being active at the company, and this
right.
was part of the reason that I had been reporting about Johnny Ive for some time. When I landed in San Francisco from Atlanta, where I've been reporting on alcohol and tobacco of all things, and
Oh.
moved to San Francisco to cover tech and Apple. I had a coffee with a local journalist named John Markoff and was getting his
Mm-hmm.
guidance on what to focus on at Apple. And he said, "Well, I've got something you should consider, and that's Johnny Ive and the Battery." And the Battery is this exclusive club in San Francisco. And he didn't tell me any more than that. He just said, "You should look into this." And
Wow.
over the course of, I don't know, 2 years and change or something like that, I just would ask people, "Hey, what's going on with Johnny?" And I'd learn bits and pieces of him not being engaged. There were just stories about him not being as engaged in the company as you would expect for somebody with the title of chief design officer. And in the course of one of those conversations, somebody goes, "Yeah, there was this one time we were all at the Battery where he was basically he had basically turned that into his office, and we all
Right.
came there and we were there for a meeting, and he was 3 hours late." And it
Right.
was just like the light bulb went off in my head. I was like, "Oh, this story is the story that I've been looking for." But the question that followed that was, well, but like, why was he doing his meetings from the Battery? Why was he 3 hours late? And through the course of reporting, I came to learn that over the course of the decade after Steve Jobs, Johnny Ive became increasingly frustrated with how the company began to be more focused on operations and controlling
Mm,
costs, and became, as he told others, a place led by left brain leaders instead of one that was either led or
mm.
driven by right brain thinkers, as it had been in the decade that Jobs was in charge.
I mean, and that story is, I think, a very compelling story in the book, where these designers are just sort of waiting around for him to show up. I want to step back for a second. When you say, when you heard that story, that was the story you were looking for, did you know this was going to be a book, or when did you realize that, or sell this idea that you're writing a book about kind of post Steve Jobs Apple?
So I wrote a story that was somewhat controversial about Johnny's departure from Apple within days of the announcement,
Right.
and it laid out this story that he had become disillusioned inside the company that he helped build, which I think is just a
Right.
fascinating conceit, right? Like, why would
Yeah.
this person who was so integral to what this company become disaffected over what it was? I mean, in my mind, it became kind of like the Talking Heads song,
Yeah.
like, this is
This is
not
not
my
my
beautiful
beautiful wife.
house,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, this is not my beautiful wife. This is not my beautiful house, right? Like,
Yeah.
it seemed like that happened for him, and I was fascinated by that. When the article came out, Tim Cook was very critical of the article, not of the factual accuracies in the article. He didn't take exception or point out any inaccuracies. Rather, he said that it didn't reflect the company that he knew.
Right.
Um, and so the article all of a sudden begins to get more readership. And in the course of the next 24 hours, of an editor in New York, with William Morrow, reaches out and says, "Hey, I think there may be a book here." Um,
Hmm.
the book he had in mind was a biography of Johnny Ive. There's a gentleman named Leander Caney who's written a
Yeah.
biography of Johnny Ive. I
Yeah.
don't think the editor knew about that. I felt like that ground had been covered. So my counter proposal was, why don't we do the decade at Apple after Jobs? And it was something I'd been thinking about, but I didn't have what writers would call like the narrative vehicle to be able to tell that story. There was no arc. There was no reason to write that. I knew the company had changed dramatically, but there was nothing that I could wrap a story around to tell that, to tell the story of how the company had changed. Johnny Ive's exit provided that opportunity. All of a sudden, you had a narrative arc, that could show or pull people through the story of a changing company.
Can you talk a little bit about sort of your sort of rapid fire education in the design world, both design at Silicon Valley kind of at large, but also design at Apple? I think it's interesting that you're in Atlanta writing about whiskey and tobacco, and then you're in San Francisco and you're writing about tech, and then suddenly you're writing about arguably one of the most famous designers in the world. How did you sort of learn the language, or what sort of uh, what sort of things did you feel like you had to pick up to tell this story?
Um, there are there are a couple of things that really that kind of, I don't know, channeled my understanding of design at Apple, and those are largely relationship based. It was
Mm,
about cultivating relationships with people who had a deep understanding of design. Talking with people like Hartmut Esslinger, who
yeah.
was seminal in terms of defining the Snow White period in the 1980s for Apple, and still knew enough about the way the company operated to help explain what design became after he left, and also knew the story of Johnny Ive and like how he got the job to stay
Right.
on and work with Steve Jobs. But beyond that, it was watching documentaries and or reading basic books like Hartman's book, or I'm looking up at the ones on my shelf like New American Design,
Oh yeah.
or you know uh Less But Better, Artful Making, some of these
Yeah.
books,
Yeah.
and meeting with some of the figures, or talking to some of the figures that were important in kind of the formative period of either industrial design or UI, and trying to gather what I could about the way the disciplines had evolved over time.
It's interesting to me that Apple is sort of held up still in many ways. I think this is probably less so than it was, but still held up as sort of the epitome of design and business. And I remember when I was in design school, Apple was held up both for like the design of their products, but also their branding, their advertising is just like, this kind of holistic approach. And you sort of get into that a little bit, and I know this is outside of sort of the purview of your book, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how in your reporting how design is talked about inside Apple. How does Apple define design, I guess?
With reverence. I mean, that's the only word that I can think of. It comes to mind, first and foremost. Whether you're talking to somebody, and it's important that to the degree your audience does or doesn't know this, Apple is so siloed.
Right.
Divisions don't overlap. You don't have a lot of cross pollination between, say, people in legal and people in
Mm,
design, or even in many instances, people in software engineering and people in industrial design, like that. They don't commingle, and they don't cross pollinate. But the one thing that's almost universal was like the reverence for that design studio and for the designers themselves. You would talk to some people who might be in a recruiting or HR capacity, and they talk about these guys and describe them as like the campus Jedi's.
right.
They were these
Right.
mythical figures that did all the great things for Apple, in much the same way Imagineers are held up at Disney as kind of the pinnacle of what Disney aspires to do and bring to the world. And I mean, they're also kind of the cool kids on campus.
Right. Right.
If you got a badge and you were able to access the design studio, that was your cachet. That was your kind of point of arrival, much more so than whatever allocated, whatever stock allocation you might get from the company in any given year. That was what people really aspired to.
Was that sort of the big change in the post Steve Jobs Apple? Is that some of that sort of company cachet was lost in some way, or were there other sort of process changes or institutional changes in how design was thought of or treated in the Tim Cook era? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, it's not. There's I would argue there's been no real diminishment in terms of this,
Mm,
the kind of the theoretical standing of design at the company. It's still revered, but I think its place in the hierarchy of the company, and this is a very hierarchical company, has changed. When Steve Jobs was there, he told his biographer Walter
right,
Isaacson that that Johnny Ive was the second most important person at the company with the most operational power outside of Jobs himself.
right,
He really put Johnny at the top of the totem pole, so to speak, and most things flowed from Johnny and the design studio down through the rest of the company. What happens after Jobs' death is that the company goes through this insane growth, and instead of making 20 million iPhones a year, it's making 200 million iPhones a year. And to shoulder that load, they need to hire a lot more staff. And the book goes into some detail about the way the studio was structured and some of the rules that existed to kind of protect and preserve the ethos of design and kind of uh, I guess the reverence for design. And over time, like some of those rules are violated because you just have a lot more people coming in and out of the design studio, which beforehand was relatively bespoke, and they did a pretty good job of maintaining order in terms of who came in and out.
I'm going to ask a question that is going to sound like a criticism, or like
Hmm.
I have a problem with your writing, and I hope it doesn't come across this way, because it was something I found myself thinking about a lot in sort of the myth making of Apple's design team. And I'm wondering if you could kind of help me understand this and pick this apart a little bit, because there is this myth. You say that in the book, you said that Jobs kind of made Ives central to product development, and then the quote to Walter Isaacson that you were mentioning is, Jobs said he gets the big picture. He understands Apple as a product company. He is not just a designer. And all of this is sort of, in this myth making of the design team at Apple. But then at the same time, you were sort of writing about a little bit the development of the iPod and sort of the conflicting teams there. And when Ive came in and his team came in to work on the products, it always seemed later. It didn't seem like the design team was actually sort of developing these new product categories, aside from the watch, which we can talk about in a second.
Hmm.
And I'm wondering, could you kind of talk about where the design team came in and how much they were really driving product development or product categories, or was it really a sort of aesthetic and kind of shape uh, process?
No, I think that's a totally valid question. Certainly don't take that as a criticism. I think there's an issue of chronology there.
Mhm.
When you look at the iPod, if you think about it, let's back up one further product, to the iMac. I mean, design with the iMac saved Apple. I mean, that it's that simple.
Right, right.
That product was a product that was a runaway success, largely because of the way the computer looked, and certainly the engineering and the way it functioned and everything else.
Right.
But it was sold to the country based on how it looked. I mean, Jobs unveiled it and said
Yeah.
it's like it's from another planet, a planet with better designers. Right.
Right, right.
The company was basically bankrupt at that time. I mean, this became the fastest selling computer of all time, so that puts design into the conversation in a way that it hadn't been
Hmm.
before then at Apple. So that's step one. Step two, iPod. If you look at the iPod, you're totally right. It was a product that was kind of driven by like more of the engineering side of Apple.
Hmm.
Johnny came in late. He was asked to what he said, to what he bristles at this, but was asked to essentially skin the product.
Right,
So
right.
just give it an external aesthetic and look and feel and everything else. But in doing so, he was very insistent about the notion of white and the white headphones. Those white headphones became the focal point of the marketing and the advertising campaign that was so
Hmm. Hmm.
memorable that we all know, with the colors and the white headphones and everything else. They became kind of what, in pop culture, was a jumping off point for why that product did well. People also fully understand that the product did really well because iTunes made it very easy to transfer
Right,
songs
right.
and everything else, right? But at that point, you're right. Design was not front and center. It is in the wake of that design becomes more of a a centerpiece of where product development begins. If you look at the MacBook Air,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the way MacBooks began to be made around that time, and what that did for our notion and understanding of how slim and slender and lightweight laptops could be, that was design driven, right? And it
Okay.
was it was design driven, but then also the execution of it was largely carried out by an operations team that was able to get the CNC machines to to cut the aluminum and fulfill that kind of design spec that Johnny Ive and the team laid out. And then with the iPhone, that was, you're right. It
Oh,
was
that
a
was, I said iPod, but I meant
yeah,
iPhone
an
when I was talking about
iPhone.
the
Okay,
Mac.
okay,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. And with the iPhone, you did have a team effort, but you have to, like, the one thing that I think points to Johnny's role in it is that some of the key figures who were searching for a new way to have a user interface. They housed that project inside the design studio, which
Mm.
spoke to the power of the design studio inside the company. Johnny could essentially house that, fund it, protect it, nurture it, and then present it to Steve Jobs, who, when he first saw it, I mean, it was on this giant table, right? Was dismissive of it. He was like, well, we can never do anything with this. But
Mhm.
Johnny then, says to him, well, like, but Steve, think about the idea of like this, this touch face, this touch screen experience being on the back of a camera, for example, a digital camera, as opposed to a bunch of buttons. You're just touching the screen itself. And that was part of the inspiration for Steve to give the idea a second look and a second thought. And
And
then
that all came from the design team then. That wasn't
that
something that was
that
coming from like the like Rubenstein and those guys.
No, Ruby was mostly gone by this point,
Okay.
and yeah. So what then comes out of that while that was housed in the design studio, what comes out of that is like kind of like I don't know, a three-headed monster of development that is anchored by Steve Jobs. But you had Scott Forstall developing the
Right.
software, you had Tony Fadell leading the engineering effort, and then you had Johnny Ive and the design team developing kind of the look and feel that would bring it all together. So yeah, I mean, you're right. Like there is a team component of this, but the one thing Jobs did over time was elevate Johnny further and further in terms, and empower him more and more. So the quote to me is important in so much as what it signifies and what it told the world before Jobs died, and how it entrenched Johnny at the company, as much as anything. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, this sort of leads into perhaps a two-part question. You write this really interesting passage, and forgive me, I can't remember if this happened after Steve Jobs or while Jobs was still alive, where Johnny essentially kind of co-ops this operations teams that he renames manufacturing design, and so there's now this sort of triad of design teams. There's industrial design, product design, and manufacturing design. Was Steve Jobs still alive at
Steve
this
Jobs was
point?
still alive then. Yeah, yeah.
So can you talk about sort of those three teams? I think you were starting to get into this a little bit, and sort of how those work together, because the question that I'm getting to is like the constraints of like chip design, or the size of hard drives or something. Was that being driven by these design teams at this point, or were those separate teams, like the actual how it works, was that still happening somewhere else?
So manufacturing design was something that Johnny brought into the fold alongside product design. And part of the reason that anecdote's in the book is it's meant to also illustrate like that even in someone like Johnny Ive, who in the book, as I noted, it can be a bit reductive, is kind of described as like an artist, a designer,
Yeah.
etc. How somebody like that can bring operational, um, operational kind of like genius, or operational kind of
Hmm.
execution to what they do. And so what he did was he assembled this kind of triangle inside the company, with industrial design at the top, product design in one corner, and manufacturing design in the other. Product design was kind of responsible for assembling all the pieces of engineering, and all the engineering for a product that the industrial design team was driving the development of, and
Hmm.
driving the look and feel of, but also like the purpose of. And then in the other corner you had manufacturing design, which was fulfilling these kind of like insane requests about how about like making the actual product, so
Hmm.
those three groups were working in harmony. And that was really an outgrowth of Johnny's vision for putting design, I guess, at the center of what Apple did with its product development.
I mean, I think that's why that passage was so interesting to me, and I think that reductive quality that you're talking about is true, and I can't help but think part of that is part of that sort of reductive view of I from the outside is partially his fault in some way, to be honest, with those videos of him in the white room talking about like the beveled edges and like the intricacies of the curves. He does come across as an artist, and design does, they communicate design purely aesthetically sometimes, and don't communicate sort of that manufacturing as much. And I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about how that evolved post Steve Jobs, where I've did start to kind of take a more management role, more leadership role across the company, um, how that affected that triad of design teams.
I, so the triad, um, during the course of the watch development had to expand considerably because, and this is, I guess, a convoluted way of answering your question, but like it is in the watch that you see kind of a change to the way that group function.
Mhm.
The watch had three different materials for cases when it was launched. It had a
Right.
multitude of bands. Each of these SKUs had to have a support team of operations figures, essentially manufacturing design people and product design people. The team swelled. Prior to this, there were, as I alluded to earlier, there were a lot of rules about what you could and couldn't say in the studio. Johnny has this idea that ideas are fragile, and he
Right.
didn't want anything that could interfere with an idea before he felt like it could take flight, so to speak. And so there were rules like you can't talk about costs, you can't talk about engineering obstacles. You were merely meant to kind of absorb what the industrial design team wanted to accomplish, and then try to go figure it out later on your own. I mean, that was kind of the expectation. But as the watch process developed and you have these there are many more people from operations coming into the fold, into the studio, they're not as sensitive to these rules. And so people who were sensitive can recall sitting down at the table as a couple of designers, this anecdote's in the book, as a couple of designers are talking about the importance of how the digital crown needs to be made. And
Right. Right.
these
Yeah.
these operations guys are saying, yeah, but we can save a few bucks if we do this way of making it. If we laser etch it instead of doing uh, the more complicated and costly machining of it that you guys want. And the two designers are looking at the guy like he's got three heads and saying like, wait, what are you doing? Like, he's clearly violating the rules of the studio, talking about costs. And they kind of try to put him in his place by saying, well, that's not something Apple would do, that's something Samsung would do.
Right. Right.
But that kind of speaks to how things, I don't, how I guess the train began to veer off the tracks a little bit. It's almost like it needed to go faster and faster to keep pace with all the demands, and it began to rattle on the tracks, so to speak.
I want to come back to that for a second, but you mentioned something else that I just want to talk about. You referred to Ive as an artist, and you referred to him as an artist throughout the book, and I'm very curious about that decision. You refer to him as a designer sometimes, but the chapter about him is called The Artist. You refer to him as that. What kind of can you talk about why you made that decision?
And why I made that decision. Yeah, I mean, it certainly I could appreciate with your audience that that'd be like a little too twee or whatnot. I mean, part of it is, you know, the designer and the operator doesn't quite, sharpen the relief between Johnny Ive and Tim Cook, right? I mean,
Right.
the sensibilities that Johnny brought to product development transcend, in the eyes of like a layperson, certainly not in the eyes of a designer. And I don't think Johnny would consider himself. I mean, I think there's art to what he does, but I don't think he would put that label on himself. But what he brought to the product development process, there was a certain creative aspect of it that I wanted to speak to and reflect in the book. And so that label I thought was better than merely using the designer. Not to mention, like, if you just use the designer, it would be pretty hard to turn through all the pages because it would just be loaded with that word over and over again. And I know that word's in the book way too many times. I would hate to do kind of a Control C and see, or
Yeah.
Control F and see how many times I use the word designer, much less the word artist. But it was a little bit about adding some poetry to what he brought to product at Apple.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have a couple other questions sort of about Johnny and the process a little bit, and then I want to step back and kind of talk about sort of the book at large again. Um, but it seems to me reading the book, one of the big frustrations that I've had uh, with Tim Cook, or at least with Tim Cook's Apple, is sort of the just missing his friend and his his colleague and his collaborator. And you mentioned a couple times in the book Jobs was in the studio every day, and that was not Tim Cook's really kind of mode of working. And in seeing Ive take on a bigger role and really lead the development of the watch, I can't help but see Steve Jobs as a sort of editor there, a way to, um, you know, honor the fragility of ideas, but also steer those ideas in some way. And you talk about, the sort of epic launch that Ive wants to do, the $30,000 version, the kind of focus on fashion as opposed to functionality. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and sort of what you were able to learn about I've kind of essentially trying to take on the Jobs role, trying to be both designer and editor in that process.
Right. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's you hit on a couple of things there that I think drew me and kind of like drew me to the topic and kept me motivated as I worked on this. One of those being grief. I mean, it's not
Mm-hmm.
often that you're writing about the business world and you're writing about grief. This is a
Mm-hmm.
very unique company, to lose somebody that was as beloved and also polarizing as Steve Jobs was. People had very conflicting emotions about him, but universally at Apple, there was this period of mourning that I think for many people is not yet over, right?
Right, right.
Because it was so inspirational to work with somebody as gifted and talented as he was. And few people, probably felt that as pointedly as I've did, because they had this strange relationship where that was both professional and personal. Jobs had very few friends. He considered Johnny a very close friend.
Mhm.
That gets confusing for somebody who's an employee of
Right,
someone,
right.
right? And then there's also the overhang of the shadow of Jobs for Johnny, right? His
Right.
best work clearly had been done with Jobs as his kind of his patron, his enabler, and his editor. And so in the wake of his death, there's this opportunity for him to say, well, I can do this myself. So there's a bit of that in the background as well. I mean, these are all kind
Mhm.
of like interesting things to unpack, and were interesting to unpack in working on the book. um, in the course of all of this, like, Johnny assumes a lot of responsibility. One of the things that Jobs was really skilled at was not just coming in and 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 providing guidance, as you noted, for product development, being that kind of editor and pushing products in the right direction. He also made sure that even as he empowered Johnny, he kind of limited what Johnny was responsible for. He
Right,
basically
right,
oversaw a team of 20, and it was very much like, no, you do design, right? He had
right,
influence over the product design team that we talked about and the manufacturing design team, but the team that he was directly responsible for was really about 20 designers. That was where he
right, right.
invested most of his time. But all of a sudden, in Jobs' absence, he assumes responsibility um, for UI
Mhm.
and for software design. And he also has the design team, and he's developing this product, and he finds himself pulled more and more into Jobs's old role in overseeing marketing for the product. He basically tries to replace Jobs,
Right. Right.
and becomes overwhelmed and burnout in the process, and completely and utterly fatigued. And by the end of the year, when the watch was launched in 2014, he's standing before the software design team that he's been leading for some time. This now all of a sudden he's in charge of hundreds of people instead of 20. And they're thinking like, oh, we just did the we just had the best year of our lives. We launched this new product. Like, this is this triumphant moment. And he sounded downtrodden and fatigued, and just said to them, like, I can't remember a year that's been harder for me.
Right.
He
Right.
goes on a few week vacation, comes back, and by spring he's asking Tim Cook to either hopefully leave the company, at the very least to step back from from the burden he was shouldering in terms of all of those responsibilities. And they reach an agreement for him to go part-time.
What do you have a sense of sort of the decision for Ive to take over UI and product? Was that a was that led by Ive? Was that sort of an ambition of his that then he came to later regret, or was that something that was kind of pushed upon him?
I, I think he wanted influence over that. I don't know
Right.
that he wanted responsibility, all the responsibility that came with it, right?
Right.
And I mean, you may appreciate this. The book gets into it a little bit, but it also leads to this huge change in the UI team. I mean, they
Right.
essentially
Right.
go from living kind of a 3D development process to
Yep.
a two-dimensional process, where they were doing a lot of demos, live demos that were kind of animated and on a
Right.
screen. And
Right.
they transitioned to one where they're doing printouts, because Johnny's sensibilities are still around kind of like the aesthetic. So he wants to see how it will look before he sees how it, like how the interaction takes place. So it's a change in thinking for the company as a consequence of this as well.
Yeah, you knew exactly where I was taking that question because I had that passage pulled out where these UX designers were sort of confused that they were showing stuff printed and sort of frustrated that I was really only concerned about the aesthetics and sort of how the buttons looked and the typography. And there's this quote from Steve Jobs that is perhaps apocryphal because I don't think you ever quote him saying this in your book, that design isn't just how it looks but how it works. And the UX designers sort of echo that in their demos to Johnny. And my sense was that it seemed like I've perhaps forgot that in some sense, or lost sight of that in some sense, and really did kind of go back to the aesthetics and how things look. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for people who were accustomed to working for Scott Forstall, this was a really difficult transition, because they felt like there was a shift from the focus on how like how you interacted with the device,
Hmm.
to the way the device looks. And the book aims to hit on this by recounting how, when Johnny first began to put his imprint on the new iOS that he would oversee. My memory is iOS 7.
Yep. Yeah.
He 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 presents he does some presentation for a bunch of people at the company, and a lot of the emphasis is around like new icons and the way those
Right.
icons are going to look more contemporary. And he's getting away from the skeuomorphism that Jobs favored, and that Forstall kind of maintained, in part because Jobs favored it, right? I mean, here, you're only a year or so removed from the death
Yeah.
of somebody you love. You kind of want to hold on to some of the things that they cherished. And Johnny was really ready to move on. But I think, to your question earlier, like, this is a bit of a case of the dog who caught the car, right? Um, he he gets responsibility for design, but that responsibility is like, it comes with a lot of burdens that I don't think he really wanted to deal with, including like, you know, bonuses and expense reports, and like just stuff that Johnny Ive wasn't put on this earth to do or manage.
I mean, I think that's exactly right, and that was exactly sort of how I read the book, and I think tell me if I'm reading between the lines incorrectly here. And I don't, I want to be careful how I say this. Um, I have a lot of sympathy for Ive and the grief that you speak of, and I think that's real, and I think that really comes across. But I think I I went into this book thinking that I would be very sympathetic to the Ive character, and I really didn't. um, I found him kind of frustrating and kind of hard to understand, of wanting this power and then not wanting it, and like wanting that kind of control, but then sort of shirking it, the 3 hour delay. um you have this line at the in the end where you sort of talk about how like Tim Cook didn't really understand design, and use that word like aloof and unknowing. And I was like, oh, but that's Ive. Like, he's the one who kind of seems a little bit more aloof to the process. um were you sympathetic to him, or like how did you kind of read his evolution through the book?
I, you know, I'm certainly sympathetic to the idea that here was this figure who was dealing with grief, who was
Yeah, yeah,
who assumed more responsibility than he could shoulder, who really wanted to make something happen, who was stretched beyond his wildest imagination in terms of the responsibilities he took on. But by the same token, like, some of that was a mess of his own making.
yeah.
And this is, this is an aspect of nonfiction, right? Like, I mean, while you know you can be sympathetic to Johnny in those veins, you can also be kind of turned off by some of his extravagances. I
Right, right,
mean,
right,
right? Like, yeah, he has this kind of insanely lavish 50th birthday party with
right.
a ton of celebrities. Like, you can see him drifting away from the
Yeah,
company. um
yeah.
I th-
You lost me with him when so, I'm sorry to cut you off. When it
yeah.
was, well, it was either his plane or his yacht, and he wasn't happy with like the soap dispensers, and he
Oh,
wanted to
yes,
pay
yes, yes,
Apple
right,
designers to do it, and people
right.
got mad at him for that. And I was like,
It was
I
the
really have a hard time feeling bad about this for you right now.
it was, yeah, it was the soap dispensers on
Yeah,
his private jet. Yes, no, and he had some Mac designers work on it, right?
yeah.
And they're looking at these soap dispensers, going, "I don't think this is what the board wanted us to do this week, but all right, man."
Right, right.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, we're all complicated, right? Like,
Yeah,
there are no,
yeah,
there are no pure heroes or villains in the world. In most instances, right? I mean, we could, set aside like somebody like Vladimir Putin or something like that this day and age, but in this instance, in this corporate world, there are no pure heroes or villains. Like, there are faults to be seen in several parties. I mean, in this case, you could also argue, like, Tim Cook should have just let Johnny walk. I mean, it was
yeah,
2015. He
yeah,
wanted to
yeah.
leave, right? Instead, he's got this kind of worst case scenario where the designer is still there. Everybody
Right,
still looks to him for advice. He's still empowered, but he's not present. You kind of have an estate being run remotely, or a farm being run remotely by some kind of
right.
someone who's not there with his hands on, and then showing up and saying, like, "Oh, no, you planted corn this season." No, I wanted to plant barley, and they got to dig everything up and start all over again. And that was kind of what was going on inside Apple. But Tim Cook made the decision that it was better to keep Johnny, and not suffer the potential repercussions that Wall Street
Right.
might condemn the company if Johnny left in 15, than it was to let him walk at that time. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's what's interesting about this, is that you can look at this and take your own lessons from this, if you're either in management or in the business world, about how to handle these things. I mean, nobody would argue that Johnny left Apple the right way, but also would argue that, like, how do you know the right way to leave a place that you've spent more than 2 decades building into the largest business in the world?
Right. I mean, and that goes back to this subtitle of the book, how they became a $1 trillion company and lost their soul. And I think, coming from a design side, I came up in a design culture where designers were talking about wanting to have a seat at the table, wanting the C-level designer. And in a way, this is sort of the what I found interesting about this book is that it was sort of a it showed the double-edged sword of that. It showed that as design is elevated, it does get more complicated. You do move away from the actual sort of core of what you're good at or what you want to do. And it seems to me we haven't talked about Tim Cook much. In reading the book that it seemed like Apple is and was a company that was filled with executives, and rightly so, who thought that they could be the next Steve Jobs. I think Scott Forstall was very much this way. I
Mhm.
think, Johnny Ive was this way. And that the only one who like really didn't think he could be the next Steve Jobs was Tim Cook, and has kind of been the one who has been the most successful of not trying to step into that role in some way.
Right, right. No, he certainly he was ready for it, but he wasn't pining for it, I guess you could say,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
He did it out of kind of a sense of duty, and and he's
Mm,
he's I guess his he's caught his stride in that role. But initially at the outset, I think there was some nervousness for him, right? I mean, he was all of a sudden being elevated from a peer to Johnny Ive and Scott Forstall and Eddie Q and
mhm,
Phil Schiller and all the figures on the executive team to being at the head of the table. And there's awkwardness to that, and not only and that awkwardness is compounded for Tim Cook by the deep deep skepticism externally outside the
right.
company and the pressure that and the doubters who really didn't think he'd succeed.
I want to sort of step out of the book for a second as we head towards the end of the conversation. I imagine, this book is incredibly well reported, and your sources. I'm. There were times where I'm like, how did he get? How does he have this information? And so I imagine that you're still talking to a lot of those people, and I'm wondering kind of what your sense of design at Apple now. I mean, you just reported a couple of weeks ago about this sort of relationship with Ive and his sort of independent consultancy has ended. Design has moved under Jeff Williams, who is operations guy now. From my opinion, I think Apple's making some of their best products that they have in a long time now. I have one of the new MacBook Pros, and it's like amazing. Um, what's sort of how is design sort of living under this new organizational structure now?
Yeah, I mean, you said it earlier. Designers long pine or talked about and like hope for and aspire to have a seat in the C-suite. And the big radical change in Johnny Ive's exit is that the design studio no longer has that
Right,
place, right? And
right.
now they're flowing up through the chief operations officer. So, in terms of the way the operations have changed and the role of design, it is I don't know. It is now more level set with some of the other groups at the company, and not quite at the forefront in many ways. Much of the product leadership has shifted to the product marketing team, which
Mm,
played an integral role during this decade as well. I mean, they were kind
mhm,
of they substituted in for jobs as kind of the go between divisions like engineering and software design and industrial design. They did kind of circulate among all those groups, so they were a glue for product development. But now their voice is greater and having more influence over what's coming out of the company than it did with Johnny
huh.
still there.
So in thinking about future products, and you write a little bit about the long rumored car project and sort of the stops and starts there. Apple supposedly is going to launch a VR headset, either
Mhm.
AR VR headset, either later this year or next year. Can you talk a little bit about just sort of the role of research and development in new products and the design team's role in those, or is that something that design is still able to lead, or has it been kind of relegated again to sort of packaging, sort of like Ive at the iPod.
It's not quite been demoted so far as to be packaging. It still has tremendous influence, and what's going to get confusing over the coming years is like Ives' influence will still be there even
Hmm.
in his even though he's like that cord has totally been severed, because the incubation time for these products is so long, and often the industrial design can be set and kind of finalized. It may need some tweaks years before a product is actually released.
Mm.
And in the case of the headset, they are relatively close to getting that out the door. What's interesting about the headset is it has been a project that's been led by engineering, which is not something Apple
Hmm.
has done since the 90s, really.
Oh, interesting.
And so there's a gentleman named Mike Rockwell who's been leading the headset development, and so it will be interesting to see when that product arrives. It's expected to be introduced sometime, or I guess released sometime next year in 2023. How it's marketed, how it's its design looks, and then how much at the forefront engineering is, versus what we're accustomed to with typical Apple products. It's such a well-oiled machine there that some of this may not make that much of a difference. You know,
Right.
people people who are familiar with a design studio like to point out that like you could hand a child a pencil and say, draw me an Apple product, and they pretty much can do it, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
how well defined
Yeah.
their design aesthetic and ethos has become. And I think that was also part of the reason that Johnny felt a bit hemmed in there, because it had become such a well-oiled machine. So I think what will be interesting is if over time this kind of new wave of designers that are there, if somebody kind of bubbles up from that group and sets a new design aesthetic for the company, like that would be really fascinating.
Yeah.
Like a
Yeah.
rebirth of design and kind of a next wave. Does it become a slightly different Apple than the one we know?
That's
Who
interesting.
knows? Yeah.
I have two more questions. I'm curious kind of what the big challenge was in this book and in kind of writing about design. This goes back to my first question. Not coming from a design background, sort of learning this as you're reporting it and writing it. Um, Thinking about that this was not a book for designers necessarily. How did you kind of think about how you could communicate the role of design and tell that story? What were the challenges in doing that?
Um, I mean, a lot of I mean, the biggest challenge, anytime you're writing about Apple is the reporting and the material that you're able to gather, because the company's so secretive and kind of collectively buys into the corporate omerta that they share there, that it's just really hard to get people to open up.
Mm,
Beyond that, I mean, I think you have to walk a fine line with writing a book for a general audience, because what I wanted to do was make sure that it was kind of like demystify Apple for some
yeah.
people, right? Apple
Yeah.
Apple does a really good job from a marketing perspective of kind of just birthing
Yeah.
products into the world, right? It's like the Ten Commandments, right? Like they just, Moses just comes off the mountain and is like, here they are, right? But like nobody saw how
Yeah.
those got carved or anything else, right? And Apple's kind of the same way. So what I wanted to do was take people behind the scenes and give them just a flavor, like I didn't want
Yeah.
to go granular in terms of product development, but give them a flavor of different phases of that. And so in the book, you get that by mostly through the watch process and the watch development. It
Right.
was the seminal product over the past decade. There's some focus on the deep research that the designers do in terms of learning about the history of time, meeting with
Hmm.
horologists. These are things that like I'm sure you and your audience know is just fundamental to developing any new product or
Yeah.
or building anything. But that's not something that that kind of like the average reader would know. So I wanted to be sure that that was there. Then on top of that, there's a scene where Ive and the studio is pretty frustrated, and they feel like they're at a dead end with the way the watch should look. They're not happy with it. They have a design, but it's unsatisfactory. And he brings in Mark Newson, who's designed some
Right.
watches, and he and Mark kind of have what I picture as this kind of like design jam session, where
Yeah.
they have two books out, and they're kind of banging ideas off each other. And through the course of that, they have a eureka moment where they arrive at the design that essentially is the watch that we know and many of us wear today. So I wanted to give people a flavor of how that can happen. And then lastly, I also wanted people to understand, how much work and obsession goes into material selection at Apple.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think some people inside the design world there wanted to disabuse me of the notion that, like, well, Johnny Ive's not an editor, right? Like, he's more than just somebody who's like making final decisions about material. But I wanted to show the care that he brought to that process.
Mm,
And so there's a scene in the book, it's just like a paragraph or so of him evaluating swatches of leather, looking
right.
for nicks and feeling it for its suppleness, and like analyzing it with a jeweler's loop, um, for how the grain looked, just so that people would know. And like, this spanned months, right? Like, they were bringing in
Yeah.
swatches from tanneries all over the world. There was at one point they were even talking about, like, should they buy their own cattle ranch and remove the barbed wires so the cows don't get nicks, so that they get, kind of perfect leather
Yeah.
that could like really, satisfy the demands of Johnny Ive. And like, I just wanted people to have an appreciation for that, and so those were the ways that I tried to kind of peel back the design process without kind of, I don't know, shoving people's nose in the onion, if you will, right? You
Right.
just want them to
Right.
have a sense for how that works, not be overburdened by it.
That's sort of what was interesting to me and why I asked that question is because and again, there were a couple times where I was like, oh, Tripp's kind of just like I feel like he's just parroting Apple PR here when he's describing this product.
Oh,
It's
believe
just
me, I'm not parroting Apple PR, because Apple PR was not very helpful. But
okay.
yeah.
And so I was kind of wondering, like, how do you kind of break out of that, because they do such a good job of communicating and describing things, and I think you do. But then there are other times where it's like, oh, come on, like this, I'm reading marketing copy here, and so it's interesting to kind of hear that, the kind of challenge in that. Um, your day job is a kind of tech reporter for the New York Times. What's next for you? You're obviously still reporting on Apple. Is there another book? Do you think there's another book in the works? What's on your mind now?
I mean, I'd love to do another book. I mean, one of the things that I'm really interested in the wake of working on this book is the idea that like the question of whether you or not you need to be kind of like Steve Jobs to make something great. And by that I mean, do you need
Mm,
to be slightly tyrannical and polarizing, but also, the type of person who can build deep loyalty and allegiance from the people who work for you. And so
huh,
I'm curious about exploring that conceit further, but I haven't quite settled on like exactly how to do so.
interesting. My last question is the question that I used to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
Oh, right now I'm reading The Splendid and the Vile,
Mm.
by Eric Larson, because I'm doing an event, a writers event at the end of the month where Larson's going to be, and Larson happened to get his start at the Wall Street Journal office in San Francisco.
Ah,
So I'm going through and reading that book.
oh, nice. Your book is called After Steve: How Apple Became a $1 trillion company and Lost Its Soul. It was a really well reported book with a kind of great narrative that, like I said, is not usually what I would talk about on this show, but the centrality of design. I think like I said, this book just does such a good job of kind of talking about the role of design both in corporate mythology and in culture. And I really loved reading it and feel like I could talk to you for another hour or so. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a good one.
This episode was recorded on August 3rd, 2022. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.